everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Meet the Analyst webinar, Marketing to the Values-Driven Consumer. I'm your host, Patty Soltis, Principal Analyst at Insider Intelligence in Florida, and I'm joined by my colleague, Principal Analyst Dave Frankland in New York City. Hi, Dave. Great to have you here, and always look forward to hearing your insights.
Hey, Patty. Excited to be here.
And before we get into today's main presentation, I'd like to thank Impact.com for making today's webinar possible. And welcome Cristy Garcia, CMO of Impact.com. Cristy is also joining us from New York. Hi, Cristy.
Hi, Patty. Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to hearing more from you later. A few things before we dive in. We have a ton of information to share, but there's no need to take notes. We'll email you a link to view the slides and the full recording. But we do want you to participate. Just use the chat window on the right to submit questions at any time during the presentation. We'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A. So with that, Dave, let's get started. What's on the agenda today?
Thanks for the introduction, Patty, and thanks to all of you for joining us for today's webinar. Today, we're focusing on the values-driven consumer. And this is a topic that affects every organization in some shape or form. You know, how companies manifest their values has become a focus for consumers. It relates to where they donate, how they treat their employees, the causes they support. And if you just think about sort of from the beginning of this year, just think of the first few months, we had the Beijing Winter Olympics, and advertisers and sponsors had to navigate everything from human rights concerns to geopolitical issues to doping scandals. There was the huge explosion of publicity around Joe Rogan and the accusations of COVID misinformation and his past racial racist comments, which pushed Spotify onto the front pages of every newspaper website in the world for all the wrong reasons. When Russia invaded Ukraine, hundreds of companies withdrew from or suspended operations in the Russian market. And again, there was a lot of questioning of what companies were doing and were they doing enough. And then Disney has been battered by all sides in Florida. You know, first its CEO issued an apology for the company's initial silence, and then has since faced retribution from lawmakers. So all of these scandals and political issues, you know, do they matter? Are they just a PR, issue in a short window, or do they have a long-term effect? And that's what we're going to dig into. So let me start by just sharing some data from McKinsey. And according to a survey that McKinsey and Company did in October last year, they said 2/3 of Americans said that their social values shape their shopping choices. Now, as we'll dig into a little bit, it's not easy to parse out the level of influence. So in some shape or form, our social values affect where we shop. And as a result, it's become more important for companies to focus on their values and how they are perceived, and in some shape or form try to align those with their current and desired customers. And you know, if you look sort of historically, I think there's what we might refer to as purpose-driven companies like Patagonia or Tom Shoes or USAA. You know, these companies are frequently sort of lauded for their mission and their desire to make an impact beyond just selling products and services. But increasingly today, employees, especially younger workers, seek out companies that align with their own values. And then, as I say, consumers increasingly scrutinize the practices and statements of companies, want to sort of identify what their values are, and then potentially vote with their wallets, whether that's completely or, as I say, in some shape or form. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to dig into some insights that we found from research that we've done and answer three questions. I'm going to sort of go over what values matter to consumers, how do they differ, look at how aligning on those values presents a potential minefield for brands, and then provide some recommendations on the right way to engage with values-driven consumers. So let's start on the first aspect of that, the how values matter to consumers. And as I mentioned, values are not the primary driver for most consumers. There's probably a very small group of people out there that have an issue or two that drives a huge percentage of their the decisions they make. But at the end of the day, it's very hard to sort of put food on your table, transport yourself, get clothing, all the basics that we have to do day in, day out, and do that with a company that meets every requirement that is important to us. And so there are trade-offs in everything that we do. And so while values are important, our behavior is also influenced by things like price, convenience, availability. And so showing here a YouGov survey from September last year, in which only a quarter of companies, or up to a quarter of companies, said that they prioritize those brands' values over price. What was interesting, I thought, was older consumers were more likely to prioritize price. I thought there might have been some price sensitivity with younger consumers, but those younger consumers were slightly more likely to emphasize values. But again, this is in terms of prioritizing, not what aspects in some shape or form influence our decisions. As part of the research I've been doing, I had a great conversation, an interview with a gentleman named Drew Train, who runs a purpose-driven advertising agency called Oberland. And the turn of phrase I loved was, he sort of said that purpose, which is their phrase, is more likely to be a tiebreaker. So as he described it, it's sort of, if you've got a cause partnership on your product, on the box or whatever it might be, and your competitor doesn't, and you pretty much taste the same and your price is the same, if all those other factors are the same, purpose or values is likely to break the tie. But very seldom is it going to be the exclusive thing that drives that decision for most consumers across the board. That doesn't mean it's not important, right? So the other side of that is that values absolutely do shape our decisions. And so, in a separate survey by SurveyMonkey in June last year, decent numbers, more than half saying that they would they'd pay more for a product that supports their social values. And again, sort of 3/4 saying they made a decision at some point in the previous year based on values. So while it's not the primary, and I don't want to overstate it, it is absolutely something that is relevant and is becoming more significant and is certainly being spoken about more. And I think we as consumers have so much more power to scrutinize as well as to share our perspective that companies can't afford to ignore this. So if we dig into what's important to consumers, again, I sort of came into this with the assumption that things like the environment, equity, things like that were going to top the list. And those things, as I show in the next slide, definitely are on consumers' radar. What was really interesting was worker well-being. And I don't know to what extent, this perhaps reflects the publicity about worker treatment during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. The treatment of workers. We sort of came across this phrase for the first time of essential workers. There's obviously been a lot of publicity over the last few years, independent of the pandemic, about things like Amazon's treatment of delivery employees and warehouse employees. Uber came in for all sorts of trouble. They weren't the only one over their treatment of employees. The Me Too movement shone a spotlight. That's both an employee issue and an equity and fairness issue. So each of these things is having an impact, but in two different surveys. This one from Merkle that was done late last year, and as I'll show on the next slide, worker fairness is the thing that seemed to top the list for consumers that they're paying attention to. Ethical sourcing, manufacturing, the environment, sustainability becoming more and more important. Again, that is one where we see differences in age. Interestingly, it's sort of at the youngest and at the oldest age, and sort of those of us in those middle age cohorts, unfortunately, that's less of an emphasis. And then, I'm going to spend a lot more time later on talking about this, but in this Merkle study, they found that, fewer consumers are calling for brands to take a stand on political and social issues. So, we see different brands coming out and making stands on different topics. Some are applauded for it, some are criticized for it. Like I say, I'll spend much more time focused on it later. But what was interesting to me in that Merkle study was sort of the notion that these things are important to consumers, independent of whether the company is coming out and actually speaking about it. So I referenced this a second ago, but again, this other study, similar time frame, a little earlier in the year, but again during the pandemic, from SurveyMonkey from June last year, and Pay and Labor again topped the billing, but they sort of dug into a few additional issues, and you can see sort of race, gender, and LGBTQ equity, all of which were considered important in, again, this is shaping purchase behavior by between half and 2/3 of the respondents to that survey. So these are topics that just can't be ignored. Companies, like I say, we'll talk more about what companies say. Even if a company doesn't choose to say something proactive, they need to be very clear internally on what their stance is on these topics. And when we get into recommendations, that's one of the things we'll talk about is knowing where you stand and whether you should be communicating about it.
So, Dave, can I jump in there for just a quick second? Because you're talking about the internal piece, and there's also that internal piece that has to do with the employees of the company and what they want the company to stand for. So, for example, especially when it comes to how the workers are being treated, it's important for the employees to know that the organization has got equitable behavior inside of it as well. So you're looking at the employee experience as well as the consumer experience in that case.
For sure. And I think, again, in the conversation I had with Drew, whom I mentioned, he had a really interesting example where he talked about the mom who goes into the grocery store to buy whatever the product is, also goes into work that day, also votes, also this. And so these things, we talk about intersectionality as it relates to sort of equity. There's also an intersectionality as it relates to our opinions, right? And so all of these things affect who we are, and it both informs who we are, but it also, we make decisions in different ways based on that. So what I choose to buy in the grocery store, where I choose to work, who I choose to vote for, all of these things are linked. So I completely agree with you. Yeah. So as I referenced, not all consumers want to see brands take an activist role. Consumer opinions differ, however, right? So they've got conflicting expectations about brands speaking publicly on social, political issues. And so, there's a term that's known as brand standing, which I sort of think of as this is very deliberate action or communication by an organization, which is sort of deliberately designed to associate a brand with a specific topic. And while younger consumers are more likely to support brands taking a stand, a study last year by Collage Group in September last year, just found that only quote unquote 42% of Americans agreed that brands need to stay out of social and political issues, right? So a decent chunk are saying they shouldn't get involved at all. More than half saying they should. However, that half was fairly evenly split, or that almost 60% was fairly evenly split. 30% wanted brands to take a stand on issues that are relevant to them. 28% saying issues that are relevant to them, and 30% saying they should always focus on them. So when you think about that sort of, desire for brands to take a stand, say where they stand on every issue, it's just under a third of consumers wanting brands to do that. You've got 42% saying brands shouldn't get engaged at all, and 28% sort of feels to me like they think it's okay for brands to get involved when it's something very obvious to them. What I've found in the more conversations I have, the more I look at this, is consumers don't want brands to take a stand when they disagree with them in particular. So I had a great conversation with somebody else recently who was talking about sort of, the difference between Republicans and Democrats wanting, giving me numbers that related to that. And as we dug into it, I deliberately am not showing it because we sort of said, yeah, this doesn't pass the sniff test, right? So I don't want them to take a stand when it's on this issue, but I do want them to take a stand when it's on that issue. And so these things fluctuate, which again makes it difficult for brands to figure out. So that's a great setup for the fact that, this whole notion of values alignment, is challenging for brands. It just presents this potential minefield. Companies have been shifting for a while towards this notion of it's not enough just to make a profit. We talk about people, profit, planet, the business roundtable, what is it? 3 years ago in 2019, came out with their new purpose of a company, that it's no longer enough just to focus on shareholder returns, but they need to focus on all stakeholders, from customers to employees to suppliers, communities, as well as shareholders. And so, this notion just is another thing that sort of pushes companies to say something, to be very clear on where they stand on certain issues. But like I say, that does create challenges. And so let's dig into some of those. And the first thing I would say is, especially in the US, but plenty of other countries around the world too, we are increasingly polarized. I don't know who the 30% are that doesn't think we're a polarized country. But in January this year, an NBC survey, 70% of respondents said that the country has become so polarized that we can no longer solve the major issues facing this country. And so, we're just divided. And the challenge for brands then is, if you take a stance on an issue, and certain issues are hot button issues, whether that's LGBTQ rights, whether it's racial justice, whether it's gun control, whether it's immigration, you risk, depending on where you come down on that, on those topics, you risk alienating large swaths of your customer base. And it's almost, it's an extreme to say it, but it's almost like whichever stance you take on these things, you're going to lose the 50% of the country that disagrees with you. And this whole notion of polarization just leads to a distrust of the other, and that tendency to evaluate behavior and attitudes on an almost binary scale. So there's limited scope for nuance or explanation of why we took a stance. And so it's really important for a brand to think this through, to know why they're taking what stance they're taking, and sort of to do that, and to know where they stand on things, even if they're not taking the stance, not taking a public stance on things, because it's not always going to be their choice, as we'll discuss. The next thing I'll say is one of the absolute killers here for consumers is inconsistency. This idea of sort of hypocrisy, that consumers will react really negatively to inconsistency. And so one example I'll use here is from a couple of years ago, from last year, when Georgia the Georgia lawmakers were looking to introduce legislation related to voting rights that was seen by many in the state as sort of potentially negative toward the Black community. And there was huge backlash and boycotts and Twitter backlash against Georgia, and especially Atlanta-based companies, from Coca-Cola and Delta, Home Depot. Part of the issue, it wasn't just that they were expected to come out and say something, it's that these companies had come out and spoken about racial issues and Black Lives Matter. And, there was this sense of, it's not okay to sort of take a stance, to dip in and out of these issues. If companies are going to take a stance, they need to be consistent. And that means doing that over time as well. The image here on the left is from International Women's Day this year, where some genius in the UK created a bot. So for those who don't know, in the UK, if you have more than 250 employees, you must disclose your pay gap. And so what somebody did was they created a bot that if the hashtag for International Women's Day was used, this bot just automatically responded with the pay gap at the company. Easy for me to say. And in fairness, there was companies that were sort of 1% and 2% out in either direction. It was just an automatic response. So if the company had, if women were paid more than men, it was the same response. In this organization, women's median pay is X, lower or higher than men's. And there was some companies that were getting double-digit percentages higher than men's. There was an awful lot of companies getting double-digit percentages lower than men's. Many of those have since disappeared, and you can just see this tweet has been removed. And some very thoughtful companies actually turned around and posted in the next couple of days and sort of said, like many others, we were called out. We need to do better, and we appreciate the need to do this. But it just goes to show that it's not enough just to sort of change the color of your avatar to support an issue or to use a hashtag and pick on whatever it might be that is the topic or the day of the year, the month of, whatever it is. We're in Asian American and Pacific Islanders in the US right now. It's not enough just to come out and issue support. Companies will say, well, how many people are on your board? What's the pay gap? How many are on your executive team? And we'll punish that hypocrisy. And my favorite one of these, by the way, was they called it the House of Lords, the upper house of Parliament in the UK, which has a 5.1% pay gap somehow. You would have thought that that would be pretty standard. And I've alluded to this a couple of times, but silence is not okay all the time. Obviously that Georgia-based example that I used, those companies were trying to avoid the voter rights issue. They weren't really allowed to. But again, that was more of a hypocrisy thing because of the fact that they've spoken out before. But to me, there's two things here I'd call out. One is when Russia attacked Ukraine earlier this year, consumers around the world, they started lists of companies that had ceased operations, what they were doing, who had made donations. There's a Yale University, the chief exec of their leadership institute. He started this list that took off. He was on every nightly news show talking about what companies were doing. And he's kept that going and has a list of companies and sort of grading the withdrawal, because it's easy to make that statement. It's hard for us as consumers to look at it, but there's an increasing opportunity for interested parties to dig in and to sort of really look at this over time. And then the other thing I'd call here is Patty, to go back to your point you made about employees. There's been a huge backlash, as I mentioned, against Disney, and they've been hit from all sides. But it was employees that really started that ball rolling. Again, Disney has long donated to politicians. The employees came out and called them out for not doing something, for being silent on what's officially known as the Parental Rights in Education law, which most people probably know as the Don't Say Gay, what was bill, now law. And Disney was forced to reverse course from that silence. They apologized. They vowed to pause political donations in Florida. But the repercussions have bounced around. The bill became law, and then Disney is now facing what many are calling reprisals and repercussions from the state's governor, legislators. They're changing things that Disney has had in place. It's going to affect taxes for Florida residents. Patty, let me throw this to you as a Florida resident. What's the local perspective on this?
It has been really interesting because while the governor and the legislatures have been doing all this, it's been kind of quieter what the tax repercussions are going to be. So I think once people start to figure that out and learn what's going on with that, it's going to turn things a little differently. But it's interesting because living in the state and living actually not that far from Disney, you see all the cars that have the little Disney season tags on them. A lot of Mickey Mouses driving around in the state of Florida, and you just kind of wonder what's going to happen with that piece of it, and how is all this going to move forward?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be a case study for every business out there. and it just highlights all of those things that I've just been talking about in terms of that sort of minefield, because as they tried to satisfy their employee base, they upset chunks of their customer base. They obviously upset a lot of legislators. I'm sure competitors were delighted to see that some of their special treatment, quote unquote, was going to go away. But the law of unintended consequences, I've heard everything from, a $2 million tax bill that's going to go to the consumers in 2 counties in Florida now. So it's going to be one to watch for sure. So let's dig in a little bit to what should companies do? How do you navigate this minefield? And what's the right way to engage with values-driven consumers? Hopefully, I've shown by now that it's not really an option to completely sit on the sidelines and hope that values will just be overlooked, but that consumers, employees, investors demand visibility. So I'm going to share 4 sort of core tenets that we think companies should deploy to sort of focus and earn that trust and loyalty of these value-driven consumers. So let's go through them one by one. Starting with authenticity. While our organizations obviously exist to make a profit, the mission and culture of the company affect where they invest, how they structure the business, how they engage with stakeholders. And so brands have to start with their corporate mission and dig into that. And it's not just about choosing what words look fancy, but it's really using that as a filter to determine, are there issues that we want to embrace and others that we want to avoid. Another interview I conducted recently was with the CEO of a company called Gauge, which helps brands to sort of gauge sentiment, and then goes through the strategy of helping identify which issues to embrace and frankly how to do that. And so their CEO Joshua Dubois, he's done some amazing work especially around racial equity, and he summed this up to me. He sort of said that you need a level of intentionality and strategic planning around your values. So again, it's not just about putting words on a website. That those things, that intentionality, it needs to be focused on values. It's a strategy around values as much as you would around any other part of the business. And so that brings a clarity to values that allows the company to say that a particular issue might be important and another one might not, right? It's not core to our business, and therefore it is not an area on which the company is going to take a stand. I mentioned Drew Train from Oberland, and I thought he made a great point when I interviewed him about sort of consistency and authenticity. His phrase was, "They will get you respect." That even people who don't share your values can see the authenticity and respect it. So we talked, when we were chatting, we talked about 2 brands in particular. We sort of said Chick-fil-A and Patagonia. And they're sort of, in some respects, if you think of them on a political spectrum, they're pretty close to on opposite ends of the spectrum. But even people who are on one end of the spectrum would respect, I think, the brand on the other end of that spectrum, just because of their consistency, their authenticity, and the fact that they're taking these stands typically not necessarily to sort of own the other side or to troll the other side. They're doing it because it's core to who they are. Back in the fall, I was doing a report on CMOs, and I had the privilege of speaking to Walmart CMO William White, and I asked him about this at the time, and he sort of touched on this quite a bit in terms of, he sort of said the company, when they're thinking about what to embrace or ignore, they centered on their promise of helping people save money and live better. And that guides everything else. And so they sort of asked that question of whether something's the right thing to do for the customer, whether it's the right thing to do for employees, whether it's the right thing to do for the community, all coming back to, does it help people save money and live better? And he described it in concentric circles. And the closer it is to the center, the more likely they are to say something. And the further out it is, the more likely they aren't going to. But it allows them to say to employees, look, this is just too far from who we are, what we're trying to achieve for us to weigh in. Next up, let's focus on engagement. There's a danger, as we've seen, of being accused of tokenism, hypocrisy, all these sort of things. We just touched on Disney. You can't afford to ignore any constituency. As we said, employees, consumers, we're evaluating organizations in new ways, right? So I touched on diversity of the C-suite, or the board, the human rights record and carbon footprint, not just of our own company, but what about our partners and our suppliers? And we as consumers want to work at companies that match their values. I was really impressed when I started at Insider Intelligence. A note went around, and the number of people who responded saying, thank you for doing this. It demonstrates your values. And so we sort of both praise and agitate internally and make noise externally when companies engage in the wrong way or change course. And then I touched on investors a second ago. This whole notion of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, as a guiding principle in investing has absolutely exploded over the last few years. So corporations at every level are expected to sort of comment on, engage in, take sides in these social and socio-political issues, potentially controversies, at least have a response, even if the response is why we don't publicly take a stand. One of these, I think, overlooked aspects of all of this is community. I've talked about some of those constituents that are important, but I think the community and understanding who community leaders are on specific issues is really important. So depending on what the topic is, there may be organizations, there may be local groups that companies should engage with. I think we'll probably hear from Cristy about influencers and others in the community and how to engage with them. But leveraging these relationships and combining them with focused research, sometimes which has to be done really, really quickly, allows a brand to sort of plan and or react as market conditions change. And I mentioned Joshua Du Bois from Gage, and this is partly what their company helps people do. And he sort of said it's really important for brands to recognize that they don't always have the answers, and that's okay. But if they can turn to the community as a sounding board, because those thought leaders who know the issues, they know their communities, they have credibility with the issues. Sometimes those people may become sort of, for want of a better word, spokespeople or ambassadors, whatever it might be. But often they may just be helping you shape and do the right thing, and in doing so, they're sort of acting as a proxy for the much broader community. And the last thing I want to call out here on this list is restraint. The idea of speaking out every time that something happens, it's in the news. It's a Women's Day, Black History Month, whatever that might be. We don't have to issue a press release or put out a tweet for everything that's going on in the world. And so, companies can share positions with employees as needed, add pertinent information to packaging, engage with, like I said, advocacy groups or relevant partners to share plans, gather feedback. But I think it's really important to sort of not feel the need to go out and comment on everything. And so that requires a messaging strategy and layers of detail. And that can then be shared with relevant stakeholders. So if we're really clear on how the values tie to the mission, that should be communicated. Why the company has or has not taken a certain stand in relation to that, what actions the company has taken or plans to take, and that actions part of it is really significant. Leaning back on that actions component, it's also what the company does, right? So this more than anything else, if I was to leave you with anything, it's sort of it's far, far, far more important what you do than what you say. Our Behind the Numbers podcast, we interviewed Sephora about what they had done with in relation to the Black community and putting living up to a commitment of putting 15% dedicating 15% of their shelves to Black-owned businesses. Obviously, beauty and skincare, skin color is a major component of that. But what was really impressive was the degree to which Sephora went through to think this through, to engage, again, community, understand issues, make sure that they weren't being glib, make sure they weren't being not even not being seen to be, but not being exploitive of the issue, but actually wanting to make a difference in their community and taking very, very different actions as a result of the analysis and the strategy. So if I were to leave you with nothing else, I think it would be that the importance of focusing on what you do and how you do it, as much as or more than what you say and how you say it. So let me hand back to Patty to kick off our Q&A, and I look forward to engaging in that dialogue too. Back to you, Patty.
Thanks, Dave. That was really interesting. And I just wanted to throw one more thing out. This week, it came out that LL Bean was going dark for the month of May to encourage people to get outside. So they are turning off their social media for the month just to encourage people to do that. So it kind of ties back into that point that you just made about what you do. So before we get to the questions live for you, we're joined now by Cristy Garcia, CMO of Impact.com. Welcome, Cristy, and thanks again for being here.
Thanks, Patty. This is such a great and important conversation. Glad to be
here.
here.
I'm excited to dive into a few questions with you. And our first question is about what has changed for the consumer? Why do they seem to no longer trust ads or the brands who create them?
Yeah. So first, when we say consumer, we're talking about the most informed, educated buyer in the history of time, right? Consumers now have infinite options for almost anything that they want to purchase. And like Dave said at the beginning, if there's a tie between two brands on price, quality, so on, a brand's values are going to be the tiebreaker. So consumers want to find brands that align with their values, and that gives their money a chance to work even harder by maybe purchasing from brands that give back to the communities, or brands that spend a little bit more time on their products in order to be sustainable or cruelty-free, because everybody really wants to feel like they're doing their part to drive positivity and positive things in the world. But the problem is brands know that, right? And that can drive behavior or messaging that doesn't necessarily align with their actual brand values. And so they get called out, like we talked about, for pandering or virtue signaling, as they say, and they will get found out. Consumers have a lot of options for getting information. They can go to social media and listen to influencers. They can go to review sites. They can see what their publishers are saying. They can even look at employee reviews of people who work at the companies, who in their personal networks has information, and all of this. So all of this is to say that they no longer have to rely on what the brand says via the website or their ads. And so they don't. They can find anything, and they don't believe a brand if it's not authentic. So the concept of vested interest is a really big one, and it breeds inauthenticity. But smart brands know that they can't just talk about it, they have to be about it, or else they won't just lose the sale, they're going to lose the public trust. And that's very hard to come back from.
You know, that's interesting because both you and Dave have mentioned influencers now, and I'd love to know more about what's behind the rise of influencer marketing and why are brands seeking out these types of partners?
Yeah, it's insane. The growth in that space is incredible. But what we have learned is that consumers trust the influencers that they follow, sometimes more than their own family or social circle, because influencers have largely become advisors in many ways. So they're doing makeup tutorials or fashion or do-it-yourself, travel, parenting, you name it. There are influencers who are providing this free and trusted information to their audiences. They're experts at knowing their audience, and we can all learn from that, actually. But they are really true creators, and that's what they prefer to be called because it actually describes what they do. So then you have the influence. So then on the other hand, you have these brands that want reach, credibility, and relevance in their messaging, but consumers today don't want to hear from them, like we just spoke about. So this consumer over here is researching products, services, and companies before making purchase decisions, especially for the high ticket purchase decisions. And so it's really important that brands go where their audiences are. And a lot of time that's social media following these creators. So if there's an authentic match between the creator and the brand or product that they're promoting, it doesn't feel like an advertisement. It feels like advice. And we've seen this go wrong too, right? We've seen some celebrity influencers promoting diet pills that we know they don't take, or beauty products that they don't use. And that's why it's so rewarding when you see that it actually works and can be authentic. It's pretty apparent and transparent to the consumer.
And that leads perfectly right into the next question, which is what are some examples of brands that have partnered the right way with other businesses to find new audiences?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There's a lot of examples that I could pull from, but I think two of my favorite starting with commerce content. So commerce content is editorialized content that a publisher produces about a product or service that appears native to their publication. So an example would be if you go to New York Times Wirecutter, read an article called, Top 10 Gifts for New Moms, let's say. And so the article will only list items that the editor or author of the article actually endorses. So they're remaining true to their editorial integrity, but they do monetize the article through affiliate links. So these links track purchases. If a reader were to read that article, click on a stroller, for example, being mentioned in the article, buy the stroller, then Wirecutter gets a cut of that sale. One of the reasons that it works so well is because of the separation between the editorial team and the business team that secures the deals. So publishers stay empowered to stay focused on serving the consumer rather than worrying about, the revenue or the commissions that they would get from promoting something. So on our platform, we actually saw a retailer who went from having little brand equity and low e-com sales. They grew 470% overnight just from being listed in one of these articles. So it has a lot of potential for brands. So another example of that is Meredith Corp. They're that big media giant that owns People, Better Homes and Gardens, InStyle. So they drove over $36 million in commerce content just on Black Friday and Cyber Monday, not through advertising, just through commerce content and the links that we just talked about. So let's say, if Better Homes and Gardens, which is a very trusted source of information, was writing a reviews article and chose to list a product that they tried and didn't like, or one that they didn't try, but they wanted to list it because it would give them a nice chunk of cash, right, for referring their sales. And let's say the audience reads the article, buys it, and then goes and buys the product, but they don't like it. So what would you do in that position? I mean, I, for one, probably wouldn't ever go and buy anything off Better Homes and Gardens again, because I wouldn't trust them. And that commission that they just received, who probably cost them a customer who may have been a lifelong, shopper with them, had the product just been a good one. And so publishers know that. And they do ensure they would honestly recommend it because the risk isn't worth the reward. And they know their audience trusts them. And that's the ultimate goal. So commerce content is one type of partnership that generally produces well for all the parties, which is, the publisher, the brand selling the product, and then the consumer. So that's the first example. Do I have time to go to the second one?
I think you do.
Okay, great. So the second example, I think, for me, it's the most interesting one. And we refer to it as brand-to-brand partnerships. And so I think everyone has probably seen this, whether you classify it that way or not. But an example would be like West Elm, right? So you walk into a West Elm and you see a bed frame that you like, and you lay on the bed, but it's a Casper mattress. So if you buy the bed, you get a discount on the mattress. It's great exposure for Casper, which is, primarily direct to consumer and started that way. And for the consumers who may not have heard or been able to try a Casper mattress. So that's just something that makes sense. And then there's another case, Pottery Barn and Sherwin-Williams. So when you're shopping online, let's say you go to Pottery Barn and you see a bookcase that you like, but it's right up against this amazing blue colored wall. And you want both the color and the bookcase because they look really good together. They complement each other. So Pottery Barn decided to partner with Sherwin-Williams to create some paint colors together, which makes sense. But my favorite brand-to-brand partnership is actually one that was created on my company, Impact.com's partnership platform. So it's with Spotify. And I don't know about you, but I listen to Spotify multiple times a day. So on the train, on the subway, walking, doing, at the gym, exercising, cleaning. But let's say I'm listening to a playlist by The Weeknd, which I actually do listen to. And one of the ads comes on and tells me that The Weeknd is going to be performing at Madison Square Garden. And it says click here to buy the tickets. So I can click and buy the tickets and go right back to listening to my playlist. Think about that though. Think about how cool that is. It's contextual targeted advertising through a brand to brand partnership that just makes sense. And Ticketmaster has seen the rewards of this authentic partnership. They've driven 32% year over year growth just through that API alone. And it feels really helpful and authentic to the consumer. And that is a good sign of what creates a good partnership.
Oh, thank you, Cristy. That's been really interesting. And now it's time to get into our audience Q&A, and we've received a lot of great questions. And our first question ties into a lot of what you talked about with authenticity. So our first question is, consumers are skeptical and authenticity matters. How does the marketer navigate this? And what are the best ways to get out the communication? And how long should the marketer share this message?
Yeah, so like I just shared, I actually don't think the message should come from the marketer. I think it should come from partners that they're working with. So finding partners that align with your brand values, and letting them promote you. It's just, it feels more authentic that way. And brands shouldn't be, like you said, putting up press releases every time they take a stance on a social issue. It's much more compelling to an audience when someone else is speaking about them. And so ensuring your employees are happy and that you're partnering with the right partners.
I would agree, Cristy, completely. And I think, I think I would just encourage people to think of partners both as the partner examples you use are awesome.
Sure.
And then the sort of community partners, right? So those voices are extremely authentic. The other thing I'll say, though, is those partnerships create complexity too, right? Because the Spotify example, when Spotify gets in hot water, as I mentioned earlier, Ticketmaster has to think through, well, what's the ramification for us? Or even, maybe the Garden doesn't want to be advertising on there because of X. And so that sphere of influence, Patty, I think it gets all of these things are interwoven, and it gets really difficult to figure out what someone else does affects what our constituents think of us.
It's the most important decision, right? Finding the partner and really researching to make sure that they're someone that you want to be partnered with, because the bad things can happen. Things can turn south pretty quick sometimes.
Yeah, and our next question kind of stays right inside of that vein. And I'm going to throw it to you, Dave, first, and Cristy, please feel free to jump in on this. But what are some of the brand or company attributes that consumers tap into, deciding whether a company's stand is believable?
To me, that goes back to the thing we talked about in terms of authenticity, right? So it's not about what am I saying? It's about what am I doing? Prove it. If you come out and say that whatever the topic is, right? So whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's gender equality, whatever else, prove it. So that can be, again, representation across the organization, pay gap. But I think it goes beyond that. I think a phenomenal example of this is Snapchat, which we all think of, I think of as a social media network. They're also a product company, right? They sell glasses, and they learned that their glasses, there was potential for racial bias. Their algorithm, it's AI driven, and presumably the initial data inputs was probably based primarily on white faces, and therefore there was a concern for bias. And so they took a huge step back. Again, they engaged with community influencers, and they fixed an issue before it became a problem. I don't know that they came out and shouted that from the rooftops, if they even communicated it externally at all. I learned about it from somebody giving it to me as a great example. And to me, that's authentic. The Sephora example I used, Bath and Body Works came in for a huge backlash this year during in the run up to Black History Month for bringing out products that they changed the packaging and did it in a pretty tone deaf way that just was absolutely flamed right across the board, versus Sephora's approach of step back, engage the right people who can actually help us think this through in the right way, and then make those actions. So it's like anything. If you want me to believe you, show me rather than tell me.
And Cristy, anything you would like to add?
No, I agree with Dave. I think he nailed it.
Great. Well, we have time for one last question, and that's, with many informed stakeholders, including employees, customers, suppliers, how do you best prioritize and align your actions and not alienate them?
I bring it back to the value, what are your corporate values? What's your mission? What are you trying to achieve, and build from there? Again, I mentioned Walmart in terms of, I thought it was really interesting because you look at, Target had come in for criticism around gender in bathrooms. Walmart had come in for criticism for stopping the sales of guns in their store. And when I dug into it with William White, it came back to, here's our mission as a company. We try to evaluate it through this lens. And so if you're true to who you are, I think that you're going to find those employees, consumers, suppliers, I think you mentioned, that are right for you. And maybe one last example here would be Nike. Again, polarized opinion in terms of all things related to Colin Kaepernick. But when they did their, I think it was 25th anniversary of the Just Do It campaign, and they put him front and center and the importance of taking a stance, this, that, and the other, there was a probably day and a half hullabaloo on social media. There was a very quick backlash against the backlash. Nike sales actually went up. Nike was true to who they were. They may have lost some consumers, but they obviously gained some more. And it just comes back to that authenticity and consistency component that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's such a great example with Nike too, Dave, and perfect way for me to say, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. And I just really want to say thank you again to Dave for joining us, and a very special thank you to Cristy and to the team at impact.com. Our eMarketer production crew behind the scenes also deserves a big thank you for making this webinar possible. And as promised, we'll be emailing you soon a link to the slides and the full recording. Just before we wrap up, let me take a moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for upcoming live analyst and tech talk webinars at eMarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, don't forget to tune in to Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast at eMarketer.com/podcast. You can also hear a lot more from Dave there. And finally, please check out our newsletters. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your workday.